In 1945, elder statesmen had seen Europe erupt into a generation-defining war twice in their lives. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, put an end to the balance of power that had kept peace in Europe for a century. In the aftermath, the League of Nations was established, intending to formalise international discussion and to ensure peace. This lasted for 20 years before Germany, Italy and Japan destabilised these systems and brought Europe again into a vast conflict. From 1945, more systems were created, but again, it seemed that the Soviets aimed to undermine them. To a cynic, or even to a realist, a war between great powers was on the horizon yet again in 1945. It would have been naive to the point of absurdity to expect peace to last, and outright foolish to not prepare for a war. Uniquely, though, this war would probably feature the use of atom bombs. From the point war was declared, or even as a preemptive strike, it was now possible that a singular bomb could drop a larger payload than all of the last war's bombs combined, crippling a city. This war, thankfully, never happened. The systems in place since 1945 have worked, and great powers have been at peace, even if uneasy, ever since. Still, in 1945, this wasn't known, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. There could have been a world-altering conflict right around the corner at any point. What this war would look like is difficult to summarise, because the situation developed so quickly that assumptions and preparations could barely keep up. So today, we're going to focus on the early days of the atom bomb, from 1945 onwards. To do this, we need to establish our endpoint, and to do that, we need to outline two different types of bomb. Atom or fission bombs, first used in 1945, rely on splitting atoms. Large unstable atoms are hit with a neutron, a small particle, splitting them and releasing energy. A war using only this reaction can be called an atomic war. In 1953, 200 atom bombs dropped on Britain, it was thought, could kill 1.4 million and injure 785,000. These bombs were by far the largest bombs that had ever been used, but there is another type of bomb. Fusion thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs were first developed in 1952. They're lighter, faster, cheaper, more efficient, and they can produce a larger explosion. 10 hydrogen bombs in Britain would kill 12 million. The development of the hydrogen bomb had split the post-war period into two, with what Matthew Grant has called the thermonuclear moment. This is the point beyond which nuclear weapons had the ability to cripple not only a city, but a whole nation, and to make national recovery impossible. This gives us our endpoint. 1954 to 55, the thermonuclear moment, is the point beyond which the damage of bombs was existential. This is where our ideas about underground bunkers and the end of civilization stem from. So, from 1945 to 55, it seemed possible to fight and potentially win an atomic war. Civilian casualties would be terrifying. Structural damage could be devastating, but neither were irreversible. It was a very real possibility that had to be considered and prepared for. And indeed, the British government did prepare for it. For the USSR, the United States was not close enough to hit. France and West Germany were still in ruins. It's Britain that was the primary Soviet target. The UK government, more than and before any other nation, focused around the provisions of army supplies and the welfare of survivors in the aftermath of atomic strikes, with an intention to actively fight and win an atomic war. In the late 1940s to early 1950s, the exact effect of atom bombs on a city or a population was difficult to understand in detail. It was the cutting edge of scientific knowledge, and it was prone to misunderstanding. To make things more complicated, in 1946 the United States passed the Atomic Energy Act, making any information pertaining to atomic research an official secret, which barred Britain from access to the latest US research. and it kept information about the aftermath in Japan controlled by the United States. To protect itself, Britain needed to properly research, prepare for, and protect from this new threat for which they were the prime target. And for this, Britain needed an independent nuclear weapon. The plans I'm going to outline here may seem naive to us, but we only think this because we've lived in the atomic age for 80 years. Nobody younger than 80 years old knows what it's like to live in a world where this threat isn't there. Other threats had always been successfully countered. It was reasonable to think that this threat could also be countered, and this is how the British government intended to do so. Am I to plan for a peaceful or warlike world? If the latter, I ought to direct all our people to live like troglodytes underground as being the only hope for survival, and even that is by no means certain. In this period, atomic war felt, in some ways, like a familiar threat in Britain. In the last war, Britain had been bombed extensively. An initial explosion, the ensuing debris, and the fires which would then erupt were unsurprising threats, and they were similar to the Blitz in World War II. This made Britain the most prepared country for the outbreak of atomic war. When the United States looked to make preparations themselves, Britain in World War II was their case study. And as a result, many of the plans Britain made for atomic war were modelled on the successes of plans in World War II. So, in the late 1940s, the British government thought that a Third World War would occur in around 1957. It was thought that this war would have a long build-up, which would allow Britain time to accelerate its plans. Broadly, Britain wanted to do two things. It wanted to protect the ability of the nation to fight the war, and protect the population from the effects of the war. There were also concerns about what these preparations might do. For other nations to find out that Britain was preparing for atomic war might accidentally make this conflict more likely, or at least make it more likely before plans were put into place. Dispersal. To help fight the Third World War, Britain needed to be able to produce weapons, and would need some ability to move them. The destruction of factories, power stations and ports would severely affect these supply chains. The total devastation of production was a brand new threat, meaning that World War II was not a suitable model, and a new idea was needed. As a result, when the number of atom bombs were in their tens, a plan was conjured named dispersal. Factories and power stations would be dispersed, moved away from urban centres, and moved away from prime targets. When there were few atom bombs, and when atom bombs were smaller, these targets would be too dispersed to feasibly hit them all, so supply lines could be either unharmed or quickly restored. Dispersal left questions. How could industries be dispersed? Ideally, industries would be moved as far away from city centres as was possible for its workers to commute. But it also made financial sense to move them to more deprived areas. This would also have the advantage of looking less like preparing for atomic war and more like local renewal. There were even ideas for dispersal of industry away from Britain entirely and into British colonial possessions in Africa. Yes, Britain still had an empire at this time and was still actively considering it in government decisions. Both of these would require a lot of investment into building new factories and training new people, but it would yield more returns. It would barely resemble a plan to prepare for nuclear war at all. Logistical questions of how to disperse and how to disguise dispersal were short-lived, though. A week after the idea of dispersal was first considered, a new power station was given approval in East London. Strategically, the single worst place in the country. If brand new power stations couldn't be created miles away from targets, then how could already existing industries be moved across the country or around the world? This introduces us to a common theme in post-war Britain, where government cost was increasingly of concern. For dispersal, the short-term cost always outweighed the long-term strategic advantages. Shelter. Clement Attlee described the building of shelter as one of the essential elements in an overall plan for civil defence. This shelter would be based on three factors. the lives it would save, the economic cost, the potential impact that their construction could have on the Cold War. Again, the constant worry about this accidentally increasing tensions. In theory, Britain had millions of shelters from World War II. 3.5 million Anderson shelters were constructed in people's gardens throughout the country. They were constructed semi-submerged to avoid debris from collapsing buildings in the aftermath of being bombed. They could hold up to 6 people and were covered in soil and dirt over a steel roof. As well as protecting from falling debris, the dirt and steel could stop permeating radiation. People outside of initial blast zones could relocate in the hours after an attack and stay in their shelter for days or weeks. In practice, if you know anything about Anderson shelters, you'd see this wasn't suitable. They were cold and cramped because they were designed to hold people for a night. The idea of staying in an Anderson shelter for 2 weeks to evade fallout is laughable. But the British government didn't even know how many of these shelters dotted around the country were still serviceable or were even there at all. The same steel lining, which made them ideal for withstanding falling debris, also made them lucrative to sell as scrap metal. The government couldn't survey surviving shelters or advise people to keep them without increasing public unrest and again potentially escalating the Cold War. The shortage of steel also meant that the government couldn't realistically design and issue a new, more useful shelter either. Britain had been heavily bombed in the last war, and the priority for the government was rebuilding and repairing bombed houses, which ate up the vast majority of this steel supply. It would affect Britain's economic security to build millions of shelters suitable for nuclear war, while trying to also build houses. So if people couldn't be sheltered, they would have to be evacuated. Evacuation was central to the government's plans. The advantage that evacuation had over any other method was that its initial cost was basically nothing. The ideas and plans existed only in theory until an actual emergency took place. This also meant that they were invisible. There was no effect on public anxiety or on the wider Cold War. Evacuation aimed to move people from likely targets, areas of evacuation, like central London, to areas which were unlikely targets, areas of reception, like rural Cornwall. But it couldn't move everyone. Some would have to stay behind, on the off chance that likely targets were in fact not targeted. Who should be evacuated? For this, Britain could again look back to World War II, when there were priority classes. Children of school age, expectant mothers, and under 5s accompanied by their mothers or other guardians. The remorseless efficiency, perceived effectiveness, and most of all, public acceptance of evacuation in the last war made it an ideal template to copy. Evacuation existed so much in the public mind that there was no need to even explain these rules. Because Britain had this experience to draw upon, evacuation plans were a comparative success. By 1953, 70% of places were ready to receive evacuees from areas intended to be evacuated. Plans for dispersal, shelter, and evacuation all aimed to reduce the potential damage of nuclear strikes before bombs had fallen. It was then necessary to consider the plans to reduce the death toll in the aftermath of an atomic strike. Again, Britain looked back to World War II, and in 1948 re-established the Civil Defence Corps, a volunteer service which would oversee air raid precautions and assist in the key moments before and after a strike. A combined police force, firefighting and ambulance service which operated specifically within the context of a disaster. In theory, the Civil Defence Corps would reduce casualties by directing people to shelter, rescuing people trapped under rubble, extinguishing fires, and taking the injured to hospitals or other medical sites. It could be joined by women over 18 and men over 40, because men under 40 would either be fighting or an essential worker. Volunteers joined the Civil Defence Corps in initially small numbers, and were disproportionately old. Its first members were people that had signed up to civil defence in World War II, meaning that the average age skewed towards 60 years old. Membership increased after the outbreak of the Korean War, and by 1953 it had 300,000 members. This sounds impressive, but it was well short of the aim of 500,000, which was to become 1.5 million on the outbreak of war. It's heavily debatable how useful or effective the Civil Defence Corps would have been on the outbreak of war. Britain had the experience of the Blitz to draw upon when it came to preparing for bombing. But you couldn't really equate the bombing of World War II with one or many atom bombs. Plans didn't account for atomization, for radiation burns, or for radiation exposure. These ideas, as we already know, were poorly understood by the public at large, so the Civil Defence Corps barely prepared for them. Even before the Corps was re-established, Prime Minister Clement Attlee said that it was a futile waste to use Blitz-style civil defence against an atomic attack. The fires, the thing which we now know was the most deadly at Hiroshima, would have been unassailable after a single atomic blast, let alone many dozens. There would be nothing that a volunteer army could feasibly do. This raises the question of why, despite Attlee feeling it was a futile waste, he chose to re-establish the Civil Defence Corps. The same questions can be put against everything we've talked about so far, and it can be approached from two angles. The optimist might say that it was a method to alleviate nuclear anxiety, the lingering and constant anxiety that the public had about nuclear war. People would be calmed by the knowledge that there was a Civil Defence Corps that defended them. Further, those that were still anxious could join the Civil Defence Corps themselves, and could do their part. A pessimist would say that the Civil Defence Corps, and more broad nuclear war preparations of any kind, including evacuation and shelter, were always a charade, and they could never be anything else. Their existence would primarily be to justify the ongoing funding of a British nuclear deterrent. The logic being, if the threat of nuclear war could be evaded through preparation, then their existence wasn't bad enough to get rid of altogether. Both of these are probably correct. There will have been many who genuinely believed that they were helping to protect the wider population if they joined the Civil Defence Corps. But it was so underprepared that it was probably not intended, at the higher levels of government, to actually be of any good in the event of war. They were intended to calm people and to justify the building up of a nuclear deterrent. Essentially, they were propaganda. By the mid-1950s, the plans that the UK government had were still embryonic in scale. Evacuation plans were fully in place, the Civil Defence Corps was operable, but of questionable usefulness. Shelter plans were non-existent, and plans for dispersal, to enable a war to actually be fought, were a total dream. As the atomic period wore on, the number of atom bombs became dozens and then hundreds. A look in 1953 of the bombing of London with 32 atom bombs comes to the conclusion that it is difficult to resist the conclusion that London has become unworkable, and that, in particular, it is no longer possible to carry on the central administration of the country from here. A study in 1955 of 10 hydrogen bombs saw that society as we know it would cease to exist. It slowly became apparent that the number of bombs and their size was too much to be realistically prepared against. It's common in academic studies of nuclear war preparation in this period to see the efforts of the British government as naive, but I don't think that's a fair assessment at all. 1. At the time, it was unpredictable. The situation changed at light speed, and I would argue you can't blame the British government for wanting to confront these threats and reduce their damage, because there was no other threat in the history of military theory which could not be countered. 2. It could be argued that the fatalism of nuclear weapons was known immediately in upper government, but to avoid panic, such plans aimed to give the impression of protection more than they actually protected. The British state was less worried about society no longer working after bombs were dropped than they were that society would stop working before bombs were dropped. 3. Even ignoring the influence of the hydrogen bomb, the period of 1945 to 55 sees huge changes in the number of atom bombs. There was a constantly changing image for which preparation was impossible. Throughout the Cold War, plans for nuclear war were outdated within months of being enacted. 4. It's important not to conflate the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb. The popular perception and academic literature alike really undervalue this revolutionary change, and how much we have equated the threat of the hydrogen bomb with that of the whole period. The damage of 200 atom bombs was less than that of 10 hydrogen bombs, and we know that the hydrogen bomb was around the corner. We struggle to separate these two periods, but if we're to truly understand the Cold War, we need to. With the development of the hydrogen bomb, the scale of destruction was deemed far, far beyond what could be meaningfully reduced. Governments no longer planned for public welfare, damage reduction or army supplies because it was futile. Nuclear war had surpassed these threats by far and had become an existential threat to the concept of civilization. From the early 1960s onwards, plans instead focused around damage assessment and putting systems into place which, it was hoped, could preserve the very concepts of government and civilization.